Let me take you to a Tuesday morning in October 1857 to a small office in Lower Manhattan. A clerk is sitting at a desk, watching a machine that most people in the world have never even seen. It is a telegraph receiver, and it has been chattering away all morning, spitting out strip after strip of paper covered in dots and dashes, prices, interest rates, news from other cities. The lifeblood of the financial district, flowing through a single copper wire. Then, around 11 in the morning, the machine slows down. The clerk leans closer, and the chattering stops entirely. He waits for a moment, then checks the connection. The wire is fine, so he taps out a message asking for a status update from the other end. No answer. He tries another office. Nothing. He tries a third. Still silence. Within hours, every bank in New York City has locked its doors. The clerk does not know it yet, but the machine that was supposed to make business safer has just done the opposite. It has turned a local problem into a continental disaster. And the worst part is, the machine did exactly what it was built to do. It shared information. It shared it fast. It shared it with everyone at the same time. The question is, how did a machine built to spread information become the thing that spread fear faster than the fear itself could travel? The answer is that the telegraph was the first technology that made markets move as one body. And when that body caught a fever in New York, the shivers were felt in London before the day was over. To understand what happened, you have to understand what the telegraph meant to someone living in 1857. We are so used to instant communication that we cannot really feel how radical this was. But try to imagine it. Before the telegraph, news traveled at the speed of a horse, or a ship, or a train. A letter from New York to London took 10 days by steamer. A change in the price of cotton took weeks to reach a buyer in Liverpool. If you were a merchant, you made decisions based on information that was already old by the time you got it. You were always guessing. You were always one step behind. The telegraph collapsed all of that. A message that took 10 days now took minutes. Businessmen celebrated. They called it the end of uncertainty. If you knew the price of wheat in Chicago while you sat in your office in New York, you could plan. You could hedge. You could actually sleep at night instead of lying awake wondering if you had bought too high or sold too low. What nobody predicted was that uncertainty does not disappear when information moves faster. It just changes shape. The same speed that let a merchant in Boston know the price of corn in St. Louis also let him know in real time that a bank in Ohio had failed. And knowing that, he did the rational thing. He pulled his money out of his own bank. So did his neighbor. So did everyone on his street. The telegraph did not create the panic of 1857. The panic was caused by bad loans, falling railroad stocks, and a ship full of gold that sank off the coast of South Carolina. But the telegraph turned what would have been a slow regional recession into the first crash that hit every market on the planet in the same week. That had never happened before. Not once in the history of finance. Because it had never been possible. You cannot have a synchronized panic if information travels at the speed of a horse. To understand how that happened, we need to look at the machine itself, and at the people who trusted it more than they trusted their own eyes. The telegraph was not just a faster way to send messages. It was a new way of trusting the world. Before it, you only believed what you could verify with your own senses. You saw the goods with your own eyes. You shook the hand of the man you were trading with. You read the letter with your own hands, and you knew who had written it and when. After the telegraph, you believed what a wire told you. You trusted a message that had passed through the hands of operators and clerks and transcribers, any one of whom could make a mistake. Think about a cotton merchant in Liverpool in 1857. His entire business model depended on knowing the price of cotton in New Orleans before his competitors did. Before the telegraph, he waited for ships. A ship took 3 weeks to cross the Atlantic. When it arrived, the news was already stale, but it was the best anyone had. So he made his decisions on old information, and everyone else did the same. It was a slow game, but it was a fair game. Nobody had an advantage beyond their own judgment. The telegraph changed that. Now he knew the price the same day. He could buy and sell with confidence. He felt, for the first time in his career, that he was not gambling. He was not just guessing. He had data. He had certainty. And that feeling, that wonderful feeling of certainty, was exactly what made him vulnerable. Here is the thing about trusting a wire. When you trust a wire, you trust everyone between you and the source of the message. The operator who received it, the clerk who transcribed it, the man who tapped it out on the other end. If any one of them makes a mistake, you act on a lie. And the machine cannot tell the difference between a truth and a lie. It transmits both with the same speed and the same confidence. The New York Associated Press was founded in 1846, and it understood this better than anyone. They pooled their resources to get news from Europe faster. They would send ships out to meet incoming steamers at sea, grab the newspapers and the headlines, and then telegraph the key stories ahead to New York. This was the first time in history that news was treated as a commodity, something that had to arrive before the competition's news arrived. Speed was the product. Accuracy was secondary. The machine spread information, but information is neutral. It does not care whether it is good news or bad news. It does not check the facts before it transmits. It does not slow down for a crisis. And in the summer of 1857, the news started turning bad. Here is the part that most people get wrong about the Panic of 1857. It did not start in October. It did not start when the banks closed their doors. It started years earlier, in a bubble that the Telegraph helped inflate. The railroads were the internet of their day. Every city wanted one. Every investor wanted a piece. And the Telegraph made it possible to trade railroad stocks from anywhere in the country. A man sitting in Boston could buy shares in a railroad in Iowa without ever seeing the track. He did not know the terrain. He did not know the management. He did not know if the railroad was actually carrying any freight or if it was just a line on a map, but the Telegraph made that feel safe. It made distance irrelevant. And distance, it turns out, was the only thing keeping people honest. When you had to travel to Iowa to see the railroad, you might notice that the tracks ended in a cornfield. When you could just wire for a price quote, you never saw anything. You just saw numbers going up. And numbers going up feel great until they stop going up. The first major failure came in August 1857. The Ohio Life Insurance and Trust Company was a respected institution, the kind of bank that widows and orphans trusted with their savings. It turned out that the company's New York agent had been embezzling funds and gambling on railroad stocks. When the news broke, the Telegraph carried it to every financial center in the country within hours. Now, here is the detail that should make you pause. The Ohio Life failure was not a huge failure. The company had maybe $7 million in assets. That sounds like a lot, but in the context of the American economy in 1857, it was a moderate collapse. It should have been a local story. A scandal in Ohio, a few ruined investors, a court case, and then life goes on. But the Telegraph made it a national story. Every bank in the country learned about the Ohio Life failure at the same time, and every bank made the same calculation. If a respected institution like Ohio Life could fail, what about us? What about our investments? What about our depositors? The connection between the railroad and the Telegraph was not accidental. The railroads laid the poles and the wires along their tracks. They were partners. They were the two great symbols of progress, the two technologies that were going to tame the continent and make America rich. And when the railroads started failing, the Telegraph was there to announce every failure. The machine that had made the boom possible was now the machine that would make the bust unavoidable. The failure started small. Then came the event that turned a bad year into a catastrophe. On September 12, 1857, a steamship called the SS Central America was sailing up the Atlantic coast, carrying passengers and cargo from Panama to New York. The passengers were mostly men returning from California, and many of them were carrying their entire life savings in gold dust and coins. They had gone west to make their fortune, and now they were coming home with the proof of their success. The ship was carrying an estimated 30,000 pounds of gold, worth roughly $1.6 million at the time. That was a massive amount of hard currency, and it was destined for the banks of New York. The ship ran into a hurricane off the coast of South Carolina. For 2 days, the crew fought the storm. They threw cargo overboard to lighten the ship. They rigged sails to try to steady the vessel. But the water kept coming in. The engines failed. The ship started sinking. Here is where the Telegraph enters the story. The Central America had been sighted by other ships, and news of its distress was telegraphed to shore before the ship went down. So the banks of New York knew in near real time that the gold they were counting on was sitting at the bottom of the Atlantic. They knew before the bodies were recovered. They knew before the families were notified. The Telegraph brought the news of the disaster before the disaster was even finished unfolding. More than 400 people died. The ship went down with the gold. And the banks that had been expecting that gold, the banks that had issued paper money backed by the promise of gold in their vaults, suddenly found that their reserves were gone. The paper money was still out there, circulating. But the gold that was supposed to back it was 2 miles underwater. This was the moment where the telegraph showed its dark side. In the past, news of a shipwreck would have arrived weeks later. By then, the initial shock would have passed. People would have processed the grief. The financial system would have had time to adjust, to find other sources of gold, to make other arrangements. The news would have arrived as history, not as a live event. Now the shock arrived instantly, and it arrived on top of the news of the Ohio Life failure, on top of the railroad failures, on top of everything else that had gone wrong that year. The Telegraph did not just report the storm, it stacked every piece of bad news into a single, overwhelming pile, and it delivered that pile to every bank and every merchant in the country at the same moment. When you receive bad news in isolation, you can process it, you can think about it, you can decide what it means. When you receive 10 pieces of bad news in a single morning, you do not process them, you react. And the reaction is not thoughtful, it is instinctive, it is fear. On October 13, 1857, the banks of New York made a decision that would echo around the world. They suspended specie payments. That is the technical term for what happened. What it meant in plain language is that the banks stopped paying out gold and silver in exchange for paper money. If you walked into a bank with a $5 bill and asked for $5 in gold, the teller would say no. The bank would not honor its own currency. This was a radical step. It was an admission that the banks did not have enough gold to back their paper. And because the Telegraph carried the news instantly, the admission was heard everywhere at once. Within hours, the news was in Philadelphia, Boston, and Baltimore. The next day, it was in Chicago, St. Louis, and New Orleans. Within a week, it was in London, Paris, and Hamburg. Every financial center on earth learned about the New York suspension before the New York banks had even reopened their doors. Now watch what happened in London. British banks had been lending heavily to American railroads. They had bought American securities. They had bet on the American boom. When they heard that New York had suspended payments, they did the rational thing. They stopped lending. They called in their loans. They sold their American securities. The price of American railroad bonds collapsed in London. That collapse made the American banks even weaker. Their assets, the railroad bonds they held, were now worth less. So the American banks became even more nervous. They called in more loans. They sold more assets, which made the London banks even more nervous, which made them sell more American securities. This is what a feedback loop looks like. Each side reacts to the other, and the reaction makes the original problem worse. And the loop was powered entirely by the Telegraph. Without it, the news would have taken weeks to cross the Atlantic. By then, the New York banks might have recovered. The suspension might have been lifted. The panic might have stayed local. But there was no lag. And no lag meant no time to think. This was the first time in history that a financial crisis in one country caused a crisis in another country within days, not months. The Telegraph had made the world financially synchronous. That word matters. Synchronous means that everyone reacted at the same time to the same information, and their reactions amplified each other. Before the Telegraph, a panic in New York would have taken weeks to reach London. By the time the news arrived, the situation might have been resolved. There would have been time for cooler heads to prevail. The Telegraph destroyed that buffer. It destroyed the lag that had always given people time to think. And thinking, it turns out, is the only thing that prevents panic. When you take away the time to think, you take away the ability to be calm. And now we get to the irony. The Telegraph, the machine that made all of this possible, was itself a victim of the panic. The telegraph companies depended on the banks. They depended on them for credit, for capital, for the daily business of sending financial messages. When the banks failed, the telegraph companies lost their customers. They lost their credit. They lost their ability to operate. The American Telegraph Company was one of the largest telegraph companies in the country. It had been built on borrowed money. That was normal for the industry. Telegraph lines were expensive to build. You had to string copper wire across the entire continent. You had to hire operators in every town. You had to maintain the lines through storms and sabotage and accidents. All of that required capital, and the capital came from banks. When the panic hit, the American Telegraph Company's creditors demanded payment. The company could not pay. It went into receivership. The wires went silent, not because the technology failed. The copper wire was still there. The operators were still there. The demand for communication was still there. What was missing was the money that kept the whole system running. The banks that had funded the telegraph companies had called in their loans. And without those loans, the companies could not pay their workers or maintain their lines. Western Union, which was still a young company in 1857, survived. but it survived barely. It had to renegotiate its debts. It had to cut its workforce. It had to delay its expansion plans. The company that would eventually dominate American communications almost died in the panic it helped broadcast. There is something almost poetic about this. The telegraph was the nervous system of the new economy. It carried the signals that made the economy move. But a nervous system does not work without blood, and the blood was money. When the money stopped flowing, the nervous system shut down. Think about what that means. The machine that had made the panic global could not protect itself from the panic it had helped create. It was like a messenger who runs so fast that he collapses at the finish line. The message was delivered. The job was done, but the messenger was destroyed by the very speed that made him valuable. So what does this story have to do with us? We live in a world where information moves at the speed of light. Markets never close. Every headline reaches every trader on Earth within milliseconds. Surely we have learned something in the last 160 years. The Panic of 1857 was the first demonstration of a pattern that still governs financial markets. Speed does not create stability. It creates amplification. Let me show you what I mean. Compare 1857 to 2008. In September 2008, Lehman Brothers collapsed. The news was known to every trader on Earth within minutes, and the reaction was not calmer because the information was faster. It was more violent. The Dow fell by 500 points in a single day. The credit markets froze. Banks around the world stopped lending to each other. Governments had to step in with trillions of dollars to prevent a complete collapse. The same dynamic that turned a New York bank failure into a global crisis in 1857 turned a single investment bank failure into a global crisis in 2008. The technology changed. The speed increased. But the logic was identical. Everyone reacted to the same information at the same time. And the reaction amplified the original shock. The modern equivalent of the telegraph is the algorithmic trading system. In 1857, the telegraph spread news in hours. Today, algorithms react in milliseconds. They scan headlines. They parse earnings reports. They execute trades before a human being has even finished reading the first sentence. The speed has increased by a factor of millions. But the pattern is the same. Everyone reacts to the same information at the same time, and the reaction amplifies the original shock. Here is the uncomfortable lesson. We like to believe that more information makes us smarter. We like to believe that if we just had faster access to data, we would make better decisions. The telegraph proved that this is not true. More information, delivered faster, does not make us wiser. It makes us faster at being wrong. The Panic of 1857 was not caused by ignorance. It was caused by knowledge. Knowledge delivered too quickly. Knowledge delivered to too many people. Knowledge that made everyone reach the same conclusion at the same time. And that conclusion was fear. When a rumor spreads slowly, it has time to be checked. It has time to be corrected. It has time to be evaluated. When a rumor spreads instantly, it becomes fact before anyone can verify it. And in a financial panic, an unverified rumor is just as dangerous as a verified truth, because people act on what they believe, not on what is true. The telegraph is gone. The ticker tape is gone, but the pattern never changed. Speed amplifies, fear travels, and the only defense is the one thing the telegraph could never deliver, the discipline to wait. The telegraph promised to shrink the world, and it did, but shrinking the world also meant that every wound became a shared wound. Every failure became everyone's failure. The Panic of 1857 was the first time that a bank failure in one city became a crisis on every continent. The machine that made it possible was not a villain. It was just fast. And speed, it turns out, is not the same as wisdom. So here's what I want you to do. The next time you see a market move on a headline, ask yourself one question. Would you make the same decision if you had to wait a week to confirm the news? If the answer is no, you have just identified the difference between reacting and thinking. The men of 1857 did not have that choice. The telegraph took away their time to think. It gave them the news so fast that they had no chance to process it, no chance to question it, no chance to wait and see. You still have that choice. You can close the app, you can wait a day, you can let the information settle before you act on it. That is not a luxury. That is a discipline. And it is the only thing that separates you from the panic crowds of 1847. The last wire of the American Telegraph Company went silent in 1857, not because the technology was obsolete. Not because the demand for communication had vanished, but because the economy that powered it had collapsed. The wires came back. The economy recovered. Western Union went on to dominate American communications for a century. The pattern never changed. Speed amplifies, fear travels, and the only defense is the discipline to wait. The Telegraph did not cause the panic. It just made sure nobody could ignore it. And that, more than the gold that sank or the banks that failed, is the real story of 1840.